All right, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who are still with us, we appreciate you hanging in. We think we brought you the most exciting content in the last session of the day, so I hope you agree. We are really going to look for audience questions here at the end, so lights are a little bright, but I'm assuming there's roaming mics. So we're going to get kick-started off a little bit. I've got a few questions for our panelists, and then really look to engage in a discussion about the future of manufacturing from a decentralized manufacturing perspective. So I'm going to ask everybody to give a little bit of an introduction of who they are and their organization so that we have the context of their perspective and the lens we bring. I'm going to just say a very few points at the beginning. First of all, I think it's amazing how fast this conversation about decentralized manufacturing has evolved, how quickly it's evolved. I think a year, 18 months ago, everybody says this is science fiction, and I think if you haven't been impacted by the fact that it is now actually here, it's here, and I think hopefully this conversation will convince you. Probably the most intelligent thing I'll say today is that people ask me what decentralized manufacturing means, and I think what we can say for sure is it's not centralized manufacturing. There seems to be some difference of opinion. The FDA has some definition circulating around. I'm not sure I love, but it's a discussion we're having with them about what it means. But it means at the very least manufacturing nearer to the patient and the hospital which is delivering their care, right? And I think for many of us, for all of us in this room, I think that the hashtag of the year has been patient accessibility, right? And I think there's going to be a lot of solutions brought to bear to address patient accessibility. And one of them, I think, a lot of, for this group of people is to enhance patient accessibility. What it is not necessarily is point of care manufacturing. So it certainly could include manufacturing in the hospital, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that. It could mean near point of care, right? It's decentralized in some way. I think it is also just manufacturing. It is agnostic as to the product. It is, in many ways, contract manufacturing or manufacturing in a decentralized way. We can debate about whether it makes more sense for auto versus allo, but there's nothing necessarily inherent in that. And I think the other thing that we know right now is that for the most part, in most jurisdictions, it has to happen in clean rooms. So, I'll open it up to see if any of you have any debate about any of those opening statements that I opened with. But let's start with a round of introductions, starting with you, Boro.
Yeah, my name is Boro Dropulić. I wear two hats. I'm the Executive Director of Caring Cross, a nonprofit, and the CEO of Vectra Biomed, a public benefit corporation that makes vectors. So I've been in the gene therapy space since the late 1980s. I was in academia. I started some companies and then eventually transitioned to create the nonprofit to enable affordability and access with a different model, particularly using decentralized manufacturing.
And the second hat?
And the second hat is affordability of the most expensive ingredient in making some of these cellular gene therapy products, and that's the vector.
Hi, Ian Gaudet. I'm the head of U.S. Technical Operations for Galapagos. We're focused on decentralized cell therapy manufacturing and delivering, and very happy to be up here talking about this issue. It's obviously core to our model, but it's great to see this coming along as a reality and not a pipe dream. And we're getting closer to making it scalable so that we really can improve access to patients that is so sorely lacking right now.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, ARM, for being here. I'm Matt Hewitt. I'm the Chief Technical Officer for the Manufacturing Business Division at Charles River. That encompasses our activities within CDMO, testing, as well as sterility, microbial sterility solutions. So we make all different types of products, certainly in the CDMO, from raw materials, drug substance, drug product, including several commercial therapies. And on the testing side, support a variety of companies that need testing services, primarily in CMC testing. And then for sterility, it's our LAL endotoxin testing combined with Accugenix microbial ID platform. So general kind of CDMO, CMC testing solutions that are used throughout the industry.
Hi, I'm Lisa Kretzschmar, Senior Scientific Advisor for Cell and Gene Therapy at BioIVT. BioIVT is a leukopak biospecimen provider, providing a lot of starting materials for the cell and gene therapy industry. Prior to BioIVT, I've been at several other tool providers, launching equipment such as Miltenyi Biotech, Millipore Sigma, and other startup tool providers.
And I'm Lee Buckler, Senior Vice President of Advanced Therapies for Blood Centers of America. And BCA is a cooperative of independent blood centers across the United States with about 400 facilities serving the biosupply relationships to hospitals across about 43 states. Sweetest spot, obviously, is blood collections. We have 400 apheresis machines, which makes it the single biggest apheresis network of machines and beds in the country. Super invested in that and providing local, affordable apheresis collections. And also now with 15 different sites already with ISO 7 capabilities at their sites, and a growing interest in continuing to invest in that. And we have an announced partnership with Galapagos to support the build out of decentralized manufacturing facilities across the country, the first of which was just recently announced in San Diego. So I'll start first. Does anybody have any objections or anything to add to my opening statements? Okay, we've level set. So Ian, I'm gonna pick on you to start. You know, I think one of the first big challenges people have had, and maybe still continue to have, when they think about all the sites it requires to put in place to do decentralized manufacturing in any particular region, is how do you possibly quality control reproducible to specification product when you have so many disparate manufacturers and facilities? From your perspective, because I know you've different people out there, but I'll start with yours.
Definitely a valid question. We go about it with a phrase we call consistency by design. It's really inherent to our design of our platform. How can we make this consistent site to site? And it really is focused on two pillars, and that's automation and standardization. So fairly straightforward, but that's really the only way to make comparability possible, even between a small number of sites, much less a large number of distinct sites. But yeah, really by standardizing as much as possible, standardizing the equipment, standardizing how we deliver training, standardizing the materials, not leaving any of those choices up to individual sites because they will invariably drift over time. So minimizing what is possible to change and automating everything that is possible to automate. Our manufacturing process is automated. We have digital quality management, and we're continually assessing and iterating our analytical life cycle to make sure that we have the most up-to-date methods in place, because that's really where a lot of that comparability challenge comes from, is artful, antiquated methods. And so we've invested a lot in developing and bringing in new methods that are more automated and standardizable so that we don't have to rely on training of artful methods, because that does become unscalable at even a modest scale.
So that addresses the site to site, you know, minimizing the chance for variability site to site. But do you have any mechanisms by which you provide centralized control or insights or measuring of what's happening at those sites, actually happening?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have our control tower that gives us pretty much real-time oversight of what's going on at every site. Another part of our model is that we have our quality personnel involved in the product release. So our quality system is also centralized, and that is what enables decentralized manufacturing.
So in your mind, the irony here is that we've decentralized manufacturing by centralizing quality control.
Correct.
Boro, you have maybe a different flavor of this, but what does it look like in your hands?
No, I fully agree with what Ian said. I mean, you have to have a hierarchical quality system where you have a reference facility monitoring, point of care facility or decentralized facilities, manufacturing and testing and reporting. And then making sure that the materials are really highly consistent amongst the sites, you know, have a supply that goes out that's consistent, whether it's media, vector, and the plasticware materials as well.
I mean, Matt, as someone who's involved in the, you know, more in the analytics, I mean, we know how hard this is in a single site. And what's your take on how this becomes possible?
Right. I mean, we already do this to some degree. To some degree, we already do this for analytics. So we have a decentralized testing solution that we have in 2 sites, one in the U.S. and one in the U.K. right now, and standing others up, where we have taken 3 levels of standardization, which I always call decentralized manufacturing 1.0, which is we standardize the systems, we standardize the procedures, and then we standardize the equipment. And so we have all the same quality systems which utilize our qual-val packs, CSV pack for standing them up and making sure they're running correctly. And then the standard SOPs, especially around analytics, is where you're going to spend a lot of time doing that. I mean, within our cell CDMO alone, we have about 4,000 SOPs. So, the amount of time you'll spend writing that versus just hopefully leveraging, someone like Charles River as a solutions provider is going to save you a lot of time and effort and money. And then obviously we also, as part of the qual-val pack, CSV is going to be standardized equipment. And so that's going to bring you a lot of the way there. Certainly on the 2.0 version of this is where, in my view, we add the manufacturing, but it builds the basis for which you start to standardize your manufacturing. So, and in that vision, we see it as, and we can debate this certainly, we see it in our bias as a way as doing it in a closed automated fashion, primarily at late phase and or commercial when you have generally locked packages that don't change easily, because to cascade those changes out to all the different sites is going to be quite difficult. So having that baseline or that foundational standardization, of systems, procedures, and equipment is going to, take you a long way there.
This is unplanned, but it's a low ball. Just for those people in the audience who are just coming to this subject, maybe we can catch up to speed on where we're at, the status of decentralized manufacturing, at least, as in some of our hands here. Maybe Ian and Boro, since you both are in clinical programs, maybe you could just give a little bit of a snapshot on where you're at with executing on your decentralized manufacturing model.
Yeah, we're actively doing this in Europe. We've had trials ongoing for a couple of years in Europe. Now with our IND approval in the US, going to replicate that and build upon that in the US. But this is a reality. It's going on. We're treating patients on a regular basis at multiple sites under a single regulatory filing, and we're making the same product at multiple different sites, close to the patient, fast for the patient.
And you just received clearance for your first IND, right, by FDA, yeah?
We did, yep.
And Boro, maybe on your programs.
We're building our networks, and we're approaching our first IND here at the end of this year. We have a partnership with an organization called Fiocruz that's supported by the Ministry of Health to actually
in Brazil?
In Brazil, yes, to tech transfer the vector manufacturing, the cell manufacturing, and they have a plan to have 20 decentralized sites throughout Brazil. And I think the model has been proven also in Spain, where there is a network of 10 hospitals that are actively manufacturing and getting reimbursed by the Spanish National Health Insurance System, CAR-T products.
So the one thing I didn't say, which I wanted to say at the outset of the session was, I think in the early days of this discussion, there was a lot of confusion, maybe or overlapping discussion between what the hospital-based innovation, non-biopharmaceutical sponsored innovation of cell therapies, which oftentimes employs decentralized manufacturing, and the contract decentralized manufacturing, which can be for hospital-based innovations or biopharmaceutical sponsored products. And although there's a lot of overlap between those two movements, if I can describe them as such, those are very distinct programs, right? So, and maybe Boro, you're the closest to living in both of these worlds. Mm-hmm. You can speak to kind of the motivations for you to support, particularly maybe in certain regions of the world, what I call hospital-based innovations of cell therapies.
Yeah, that's primarily our focus. Our focus is low and middle income countries to get these technologies out so that these products can be priced for public health systems in an affordable and a sustainable manner. But we're also doing that here in the US. We're developing a hospital network as well. We'll work directly with the hospitals to create a network and bring products all the way to approval. but it is a hospital-based network system. And sometimes, people think that the quality is different. You're getting products that are highly, therapeutic, highly safe and efficacious. I mean, that's the bottom line, right? And the Spanish people and the Spanish network and other networks around the world, in other countries have shown to be able to produce highly safe and efficacious products.
Lisa, we haven't engaged on it yet. So, when you're speaking about decentralized manufacturing, of course, that's talking about the manufacturing. But we all know that there's things that have to happen upstream, downstream, side stream to manufacturing as an entire ecosystem, as we say, vein to vein, to support the decentralized manufacturing. What are you seeing in your experience, maybe particularly upstream, but anywhere that you're talking to your clients about the kind of ancillary support that might be particularly valuable or important to decentralized manufacturing?
So two things there. First, going back to the analytics, testing of our starting materials, not only having the standard testing available for customers with the products, with the leukopaks, but also as we're getting into other applications such as CAR-T for autoimmune, we're starting to see special requests of some donor testing or donor characterization. So BioIVT is jumping into some of that with some collaborations, but also having our donor center network in the US, but also expanding globally, as of our panelists have expanded globally, having those available for customers where their manufacturing has been key. And if not a network, we've also worked with clinical centers to do clinical collections or work with distributors in other areas. So we're starting to just accommodate not only where the actual trials are going, but also what special requests are in those starting materials.
Right. One of the things, on this theme of patient accessibility that I think is so critical, whether you're talking about, other parts of the world or here within North America, is the idea of moving the entire infrastructure necessary to deliver these therapies beyond centers of excellence, right? How do you see decentralized manufacturing helping us move outside of those large urban clinical research centers into mid-size and smaller communities where we all know we need to be to get the numbers up in terms of being able to address and bring these therapies to the patients? Let's start with anybody. Matt, to start with you.
Yeah. So I think decentralized is really the only way to do that, and we have to figure out what, to your point to begin with, Lee, is what does decentralized mean? Because it means different things to different people. And again, I don't think there's necessarily one way to do it. There are solutions, not the solution, in my view. I would say that, part of this is somewhat, it's a gating activity, but it's not necessarily manufacturing related. We need to build out and deepen the bench of the clinicians that are experienced in administering, but also dealing with the side effects of these therapies. And this is not unlike what we've seen in other modalities that are new to the space, 30, 40 years ago. There was an initial wave of trainings of clinicians that were specialized in administering these, and then after a period of time, after folks got comfortable with them and more clinicians came, up through the ranks, so to speak, and was using those modalities, then that opened up the possibility to move out of those, urban tier 1 centers and out to the mid-tier or, mid-sized centers and then community hospitals. So, we have to keep in mind that that's going to be a process as well. And that's just, part of what we have to do. But I think it's going to be also relying on how we envision, hopefully, the standards evolving for regulatory over the next 5 years, 7 years, because that's also going to affect how we think about building out the network.
An important aspect of building out the network is actually the clean rooms that will harbor the manufacturing processes. And while the large academic medical centers have clean rooms, some of the smaller hospitals that still have to have, I believe, transplantation capability in order to be able to monitor, CAR T-cell patients, for instance, don't necessarily have those kind of facilities. And so we have to sort of think about, how do we build that kind of capacity in a decentralized mode? And one way to do that is these modular mobile clean room units like many companies make, but we have a particular partnership with Germ-Free, whereby we have a modular unit where you have both the manufacturing and the QC all within the unit. We populate those units entirely with the equipment, and they're deployed, overseas or here in the US, and then the equipment is IQ/OQ'd and then ready to go. So you have to think about the actual facilities themselves, how to take care of those hospitals that may not have those existing facilities, and then of course the clinical capability in order to treat these patients and have the appropriate training so they can be properly monitored when the CAR T cells, for instance, are infused.
And I think whether it's you training and setting up those hospitals, or it's things like what Patrick Hanley is doing at Children's, supporting hospitals who want to get into this kind of therapy. I think there's a number, under Shaw, Wisconsin is doing, similar kind of proselytization or enabling of hospital-based innovation like that. I mean, from your perspective, Ian, from Galapagos' lens, does decentralized footprint go beyond the centers of excellence into those kinds of cities like I described?
Oh, it has to. Yeah, we want to be able to cover every eligible patient in the U.S., and we can't do that with 4 centers of excellence. We want to work with those smaller regional hospitals. We just have to make it simpler for them to be able to participate. So we need to simplify some of the processes. We have to bring capabilities to those sites because they're not going to ever have the budget to set up large apheresis centers or freezer farms or clean rooms. It's just not going to happen. So if we want them to participate, we need to bring some of those pieces of the puzzle to them, or we remove them altogether. We have a fresh product. It doesn't require any freezers. It doesn't require liquid nitrogen or any of those things that are a hurdle to regional hospitals participating in this process. And that's why we're partnered with BCA, because they can bring apheresis to areas that may not have that capability. So it's padding the core capabilities of these hospitals that want to participate with the pieces that they don't have access to, and in turn using that to drive access of therapies to patients.
The one big elephant in the room driving patient accessibility, in some countries maybe more than others, but I think universally everywhere to some extent, is cost. Right? So on the one hand, you can imagine building this labyrinth of decentralized manufacturing facilities sounds super expensive. Autologous doesn't scale. You're scaling in all the wrong ways. And yet there are people who believe that this will actually be instrumental in bringing costs down. Boro, I'll start with you, and then open it up to any of the panelists. I mean, what's your view of that?
So imagine small decentralized manufacturing facilities that have a small footprint of about 700 square feet, where yearly out of that one facility you can produce 250 products a year. That's more than enough for any one local hospital. That's a relatively low cost to maintain. It's very flexible in terms of the unit structure. And then you're leveraging the hospital staff and the hospital infrastructure to make that work. So I think it can be quite economical when you couple it with affordable, lower cost manufacturing processes. That doesn't necessarily mean automation, although automation can improve the equation of labor. But in lower middle income countries, that equation may not work. You may have highly skilled but low cost labor that's a much more affordable solution in those countries. So you have to sort of be flexible in how you think about this. But deploying smaller units, right, close to hospitals where you're leveraging and that ecosystem is very close, it's very nimble, you can schedule patients more readily, the more advanced patients get the product more quickly. These are all advantages that the hospital systems and clinicians see and they feel that they need in order to effectively make these therapies available to their patients.
But the one thing in that picture that you've just painted, I mean, you have a clean room, low-cost vector and reagents, hospital staff. The one missing piece of that is people with a manufacturing mindset. How do you bring, because a clean room doesn't operate itself, and hospital staff aren't manufacturers.
You have a reference facility and you have training, and if you make the processes simple enough, you don't need very high-level PhDs to run manufacturing processes. So we believe that this could all be done at a community college level, where you regionally train community colleges to a reference facility. There's a lot of now virtual training that occurs. So I think it's all very doable.
Do you have a perspective? Does Galapagos have a perspective on this, Ian, or a position on this?
Yeah, I'd say driving down costs is obviously one of the major drivers that we're going after to try to make these therapies more accessible. But there's no one way that we're going to do that. It's going to be a lot of little things that come together to make the cost of these therapies, reasonable. So it's minimizing costs of supply chain. It's minimizing the cost of labor through automation, shortening manufacturing processes so you don't eat up footprint within an expensive CMO facility for a long period of time. It's digitizing things so you take the cost of dealing with paper out of the equation. We're going to win by collectively combining a lot of small strategies that ultimately lead to a substantial reduction in the cost of goods. There's no silver bullet, though.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And Matt, you made a very good point at the manufacturing day in DC, that when we focused on that last half day on decentralized manufacturing, where you said all of that's true, but the centralized manufacturers are going to also benefit from all of those things.
Correct. You said it best. Yeah, I mean, I think in general, if we look at the cost structures and we look at the systems that are going to be required in order to gain regulatory approval, in the US, which is a large market, in the EU, a large market, realize there are other markets outside of those that we're looking to address as well, which might have different structures. That's what's going to drive a lot of the things that we need to do around decentralized. So the systems and the processes don't necessarily change whether you're decentralized or centralized. And we similarly at Group Boro, we have an entire initiative to eliminate degree requirements altogether for manufacturing positions, because we see it as a trade, like any other trade, like electricians, plumbing, HVAC. They all require specialized training, certifications, et cetera, and a lot of those folks are not, many times even going to community college, and many times in the US here are going to technical centers in high school to learn those trades. And we think that that's a very viable path for those folks to get into the industry. So I think that'll help a lot. I think we also have to just look at that we're all doing kind of our part together. I mean, we had the other part about that day was we had an exercise where we tried to get down to a $30,000 all costs in therapeutic. And it was really difficult because, you start running to facility costs, labor, QC, materials, consumables, equipment, things that, you can minimize, but at some point can't totally eliminate. And then so it becomes, how can we work together on a collaborative basis? Manufacturers, equipment providers, how do we properly automate QC? How do we bring down cost of consumables to try to get down as low as possible? But again, I mean, something that is, cost is something that we're always concerned about. I don't know anybody that is happy with the cost that we're at now. But I mean, if you look at the regulators in general, I mean, it's about safe and effective therapies. Cost is not in their mandate. So, we need to keep that in mind that, we want to deliver safe and effective therapies, and then as a byproduct of giving costs down, we should do that, but not at the expense of quality.
Lisa, I mean, do you have an eye to, when I was at ISCT, sorry, I'm starting the question like 4 different ways. When I was at ISCT last year, I went to a session which to me was just mind-blowing, because it was basically a clinician standing up telling stories about the horror stories of keeping patients alive until they could get their CAR T-cell therapy, about the tremendous familial cost of patients having to travel from their town to live for a month and a half, 3 months somewhere, and it starts with, I mean, that's a whole journey, right? But it starts with something within your sweet spot, which is the starting material. If we could even collect these people near their home, are you looking toward ways that you can bring collections closer to the patients?
Somewhat, as far as besides having a larger recallable donor network, we're always looking to expand that network. We've even had to fly in donors sometimes, but thinking of that from the donor's experience. We'd like to avoid that, as that's difficult for them, especially if their disease is more advanced. We're trying to get ahead of that as far as collaborating with even upstream, what you were saying earlier, some of the tool providers on their applications, so that when these protocols can be worked out ahead of time, so that when they are ready to be run, it is less complicated and the operators are more well trained.
I'm looking to see whether there's a queue of questions at all. Really happy to take questions. Is there roving mics? Or just like hands popping up like a cornfield here? So where are the roving mics? If there are they standing
Where's
mics?
the box? There used to be a box that went around. There it is.
Calling mics. 1, 2. We got 2 questions. We got 2. We got 3 or 4 here. We got 1 over here. Thank you.
Is a mic? Hello. Interesting.
Just call it Mike.
It's okay. Interesting. Of course, I'm one of the promoters of decentralization. By all means, I think that this the only way for this to succeed is to scale out, no matter what. My question is, the integration with hospitals is not an easy one. So one thing is to have a nice clean room outside the garage or whatever it might be, or inside, but there are more an intimate relationship there. You know, you have testing in the lab can be done in the hospital. The cost of being there, are you a provider to the hospital? So that relationship, I think that it's something that needs to be worked out, and the integration on the technological side as well. Hospitals are managed by 1 or 2 big softwares in the world, and where the data is accumulated, where we come in, where we are going to be integrated there. I think that it's a very important question, because with that comes the reimbursement, because the hospital already has that streamlined, very well done. That's an observation and a question. How do you see the integration with hospitals, local ones in the middle of the U.S.?
Thank you, Claudia. I mean, Boro, let's start with you on that, because I think there's a push and pull here to some extent, right? I mean, I think you're supporting hospital innovation largely being pulled by physician innovation, if I understand it correctly, and then other models maybe you're trying to bring physicians and clinicians along with us. But let's start with you from your perspective on this integration and really training them and what that looks like in your hands.
Yeah, so the first point is about the quality testing. In these units and in the clean rooms, we absolutely have to have the QC right next to the manufacturing. So if it's a mobile unit, it has to have both. You can't have manufacturing and then you have to take a sample and go across the hospital to the QC. So it has to be co-localized in order to get that reproducibility. But I agree with you that probably the biggest challenge is the integration between hospitals of the data, right? And there are systems that we will be tackling and using, but that is the biggest challenge, because different hospitals have different systems and they have to speak to one another, because you have to collect that data ultimately for approval and ultimately for reimbursement. But you're quite right, that's the biggest challenge.
And Ian, you spoke about the QC and the manufacturing digital analytical oversight, if you will, but you didn't touch on the sort of the clinical, what is the clinical portal, the clinical integration, if at all?
Yeah, that's a part of the continuum for us, starting with when a slot is needed. You have a patient that's been identified, when can they get treated? Having direct access from the healthcare provider to our system gives immediate access where they can see and schedule things, and on the back end understand, how's that manufacturing coming along? Is this going to be delivered on time? And there is an intimate interplay between a manufacturer and a physician in CAR-T. It's not a transactional buying a pill. It's working with a service provider to generate a therapy for a specific patient. And these patients are often very sick. Their condition can change, and oftentimes there needs to be pretty much real-time communication between the healthcare provider and the manufacturer to make sure that the outcome is as optimal as possible for that patient.
And you touched on it too, Matt, right? I mean, this idea that we need to be continuing to educate physicians on what these therapies look like and the necessary, infrastructure and training that's needed to bring them to their hospitals. And I think it's probably something we could do, a better job of partnering with clinical organizations, in that regard. and it's tough enough maybe in just hem-onc, but now as we expand out into other indications, it's going to get a grander and grander challenge, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I think there's still some fragmentation that we can operationalize a lot of these activities. I mean, as an example, there's a big fragment between the apheresis step and actually manufacturing, and a lot of times there is no backward communication with the apheresis clinic about the quality of the collection. That seems to be a pretty easy problem to correct, because if they in the apheresis clinic don't know how well they're doing, and they're potentially getting bad sticks or getting poor quality leukopaks, and that's important feedback. I think the other thing that we see and can help with this is there a way to, outside or in the clinical center to do pre-processing of leukopaks into either PBMCs and or isolated starting material, so that once you get into the manufacturing suite, the only thing you do is inoculate your cells into a system, rather than going through a process where somebody has to calculate how many beads they need in order to separate cells. I think on the back end of it, I mean, certainly like what Ian and Galapagos is doing around, to have some experience in the past in this as well, doing kind of real-time product release. It's something that we need to look at very intently, and we need more and more data around it to make sure that we're comfortable doing it in a robust manner. I think when we look at network, we're gonna have to decide, like, we cannot let the enemy of the good be the perfect. We obviously want to treat every patient that's out there, but if we look at the distribution of population in the US as an example, I think something like 75–80% of people live east of the Mississippi, right? And west of the Mississippi is still quite a large area. I mean, we're sitting in a city west of the Mississippi. But how do you distribute a decentralized network west of the Mississippi to get the most number of patients while still making it economical? Because at some point it will become prohibitive. Right. So we do have to kind of take that balance and see where we can be most effective.
Second question. Where's the mic? There we are.
Thank you guys, obviously, for being here, answering our questions. You guys spoke about filing INDs. Are there any specific regulatory hurdles or at least anticipated hurdles that you guys are proactively working towards? And what are those actions? How are you guys kind of tackling this new area of manufacturing from the regulatory perspective?
Yeah, certainly the regulations are continuing to come out, building the plane while we fly it. For decentralized, comparability is the name of the game, and so making sure that the comparability strategy is well-formed, statistically informed. It just takes a lot of homework, right? Making sure that you understand your methods, you understand the variability imparted by your methods, you understand what amount of margin we have, and expecting the FDA to have a pretty high bar to demonstrate comparability, with the caveat that we expect over time to generate such a large body of data that we can then finally move to that quality range approach that doesn't require direct split run comparability. But that's the expectation right now in the US and in Europe, and sponsors have to be ready for that and be ready to do their homework and to do the hard work of demonstrating comparability statistically.
I think it's fair to say that due to the fact that there has not ever been a decentralized manufacturing product approved, is that this is really a collaboration with the FDA. We're both learning along and defining terms together, and it's an evolving field. So, but the FDA is very collaborative. They're open to all models, so we're very satisfied with the interactions that we've had.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, real quick, is that the current regulations aren't built for iterative improvements, and that's the reality. And so that's something I think we're still trying to figure out how to get a path forward. But if you're looking for things that can help with this, I mean, within the last year, the Advanced Manufacturing Technology designation, the Platform Technology designation, both really good mechanisms once we sort them out, as we start to figure out what's the best way to create platforms and then iterate off of them for different products. The comparability guidance, we submitted a lot of feedback on that, even here at ARM. I think the thing that was a bit most concerning to us is that there are two parts of comparability, the first being process or CQA comparability, which I don't want to say that's the easier part, but it is something that hopefully you sort out before you submit that report. But once you do, to Ian's point, once you do your split side-by-side comparison, you get done with your process comparability. Now you move on to actually dosing patients with the new process. And now you enter the second phase of comparability, which is clinical efficacy comparability. And that's the part where there's still a bit more discussion going on with the regulators, because right now they've said that if you actually increase your clinical efficacy, then that may be considered a separate product, even though it meets the same CQAs. And so that is something that we'll have to discuss more with them, because that could have an effect on the way that people decide how to build their manufacturing networks and how to build their manufacturing processes. And there's various other ones around, they came out with potency this year. I think that's been a very active discussion as well, because that's always where a lot of the programs get really involved, is the potency assays. Outside of CAR T, it can get a little bit tricky in finding product specificity.
Question here.
Hi, I'm a journalist, and this is the strangest mic I've ever used. I'm kind of asking for a definition here, so feel free to tell me if I've completely misunderstood. But Lee mentioned at the start that decentralized manufacturing doesn't necessarily have to happen in a hospital, but we've been talking pretty much just about hospitals here. Mm-hmm. So, okay, well, yeah, that's the first thing I'm wrong then. So, can decentralized manufacturing for cell and gene also mean it can happen in what we'd think of as a commercial CDMO, but just at kind of facilities that are more spread out around the world? And if that is the case, does that kind of look just the same as if you were diversifying your supply chain for traditional drugs, or are there other things you need to think about? Like, how's that going?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a stab at that. First of all, and thanks for the question. Ironically, the FDA's latest presentation that I saw on this calls what we're largely talking about decentralized manufacturing, distributed manufacturing. Mm-hmm. But the point is that it's being done much nearer the hospital than centralized manufacturing, which typically involves the shipping back and forth of starting material and final product between where it's collected, where it's manufactured, and where it's infused, right? And that's a lot of logistics. But there's advantages to centralized manufacturing if you have a scalable product like an allogeneic cell therapy, for instance, where you have, you can create hundreds, maybe thousands of doses from a single starting material. I think autologous cell therapy creates a whole different supply chain that's very, very unique, because it's a scale of one, right? And so this logistics of collecting from a patient, manufacturing the patient's therapy, and then sending it back to be infused creates this whole different supply chain, where decentralized manufacturing, in many people's minds, creates a much different value proposition. And the value proposition is realized as long as it's proximate, the more it's proximate to the hospital and the patient. And in some people's view, the optimal opportunity there is to do it actually in the hospital. But I think in other people's views, doing anything inside hospitals is also very complicated. And so there are people looking at ways to employ infrastructure which checks all the same boxes, without maybe the complexities of doing it inside the hospital. So it's, Galapagos has been very public. They have deals with CDMOs, they have deals with blood centers. In Europe, they're using hospitals. So I think it's not a one size fits all, but it is trying to eliminate the logistics of the manufacturing. And then also, Ian can speak better to this, Galapagos is also very convinced that fresh just works. And in order to make centralized work, you almost always have to cryopreserve. Dendreon proved how difficult it is to do it fresh, right? So I don't know, I'll let everybody else speak, but that's mine. I'm to you.
Yeah, Lee's absolutely right. We do believe that fresh cells are a higher quality product. So fresh fit cells, we think, are potentially going to lead to a better experience for the patient. But again, that only is possible when you're in a very close radius. So decentralized can be at the point of care, it can be in the hospital, but it doesn't have to be. Not every hospital is set up to be able to do this, and many of them will never be able to do this. So if we want to serve those regions, we can do that through a network of manufacturing sites, including traditional CMOs, BCA centers. We're fairly agnostic in terms of what types of institutions we can work with, provided they can satisfy the manufacturing requirements. And so that gives us a lot of flexibility on location.
There's also university academic facilities which have the similar kind of infrastructure that can be leveraged for this, right?
Yeah, I think that maintaining that flexibility is important because not only different types of institutions, but different regions of the world will have different needs.
Right. And I think this is one of the interesting things that we often, overlook in these conversations in any one particular part of the world is that the drivers, and we didn't get to this question yet, but there's many different drivers, I think, for looking at ways to decentralize or optimize manufacturing. And those are very different in different parts of the world.
Exactly right.
Right? It's very different. The conversation and the drivers for this is very different in India than it might be in Brazil, than it might be in America, than it might be in Sweden, than it might be in Japan.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for example, in India, some of our partners there insist on producing fresh product. They'd rather make the product again than to have that additional cost of freezing the cells. So it will differ. And obviously here in the US, you can't make an argument that having a very short process and freezing it, like it's not 7 days, but maybe 1 day process, freezing it and then producing it. There's an argument that that could be a very high quality cell product as well, rather than expanding it. So you can take it a couple of different ways.
But I think they also decided, with the greatest of love to all my friends in biopharma, is they couldn't wait for biopharma to come to them. They had to create the product for their own patients.
Exactly right. Mm-hmm.
I have a question regarding the manufacturing at the point of care. We know very well that the different developers are developing different type of manufacturing using different instruments. How could you manage this complexity at the hospital or in a decentralized model?
Yeah, I don't think you can manage a complexity with many different processes. I think we all, as a field, have to align in a way, like the monoclonal antibody field aligned many, many years ago. Had very different cells, different processes. Now everybody makes them in CHOs, right? And so there's an alignment. So I do think there needs to be an alignment of processes to a great extent. There may be tweaks, special sauce for different products, but there has to be a great alignment for this decentralized to work. You can't have many different processes going on at the same time. I agree with that.
Yeah, even at centers of excellence, they're already getting overwhelmed by the number of different protocols that they have to run just to administer the cells, much less do any kind of manufacturing there. So if we want hospitals and point of care to participate, we need to simplify and standardize a lot more than we are today.
But most of that complexity, in my experience, has been around cell collection, labeling, and administration, which are all areas we can absolutely standardize without setting ourselves in a box around the manufacturing, because the reality is different cells have different needs for manufacturing, and there are certain products that you need several hundred million cells, and there are certain products you need tens of billions of cells. That's not going to be the same box if we want to be efficient. So I think we should be looking at where can we standardize at the clinical centers so that we're not having different, leukopaks are all generally collected the same way. I realize there is some nuance here, but and then labeling standards, which are certainly coming out, are very important here as well. And if we can relieve some of that burden, then I agree that we should standardize as much as possible in manufacturing without inhibiting innovation, is always the key balance.
And it's particularly challenging if you're using paper systems and you're running around in clean rooms with manual open processes where you have to train people to do something different every single time. But if we do get to a future where this is really pushing this button instead of that button on the same box, because we have two different programs for manufacturing two different things, becomes much simpler. Now, it sounds a little science fiction-y, but there are people in the room working on exactly that future, right?
Enjoy the talk, guys. And just thinking about my dad, who is a radiologist at a community hospital in Indiana, and in the 70s, they had specialized radiology equipment in a flatbed truck or a semi, and it would go to their hospital, and then it would leave after a day, and it'd go to the next one and make a tour. And I bet you GE probably paid for that, right, semi, and it became the de facto, in the future as these became something that every hospital wanted to have, right? At some point, they all wanted to have it at their house rather than traveling. And you know, where I'm troubled with here is I don't know who's going to, we all have to align here. We can't have 4 different semis in the parking lot for 4 different products. So Ian and Boro can't have, right? So, but that's potential, right? Especially if to get somebody involved, you're going to supply a lot of assets to get there. And I also don't know that we have a CDMO that has gotten to a point where they're going to have regional centers rather than centralized, because centralized is how we've all been born. So,
Well, which is what the beauty of the BCA relationship with Galapagos, right? We have 15 different ISO 7 facilities around the country and investing in more and more all the time. So we are an entity that is investing in that highly decentralized footprint. And I don't think there's any reason why, you know, Boro and Ian can't use the same germ-free clean room, right? I mean, that's just clean. That's clean room is a commodity. Galapagos is not building the clean rooms, right? Boro's not building the clean rooms. So the clean room is a commodity available to whatever therapeutic developer we want to put into it. And the same thing with the equipment. I mean, you know, Ian's using the cocoon. Boro may or may not be using the cocoon. So you might have to have 2 pieces of equipment in a clean room. But the clean room, the staff, the QMS, everything else can be leveraged across therapeutics.
And
Just like contract manufacturing.
And equipment can be substituted in these clone rooms.
Right.
Yeah, so. Yeah, we use the Durex, by the way.
Patrick.
Patrick Hanley, Children's National. So I'm drinking the Kool-Aid, completely agree with you. But we've been focusing this discussion on the manufacturing centers at manufacturing academic centers. And my question is if we're thinking big enough, and if we have the infrastructure to really make an impact on patient access, if we're only focusing on those centers of excellence, and if instead we need to be creating the infrastructure at community outpatient hospitals or doctors' offices and other, not even oncology offices, but autoimmune and things like that. So maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're already starting those conversations, right? I mean, I think many people are already starting to look. I mean, we're looking at putting apheresis. I mean, certainly we call it mobile apheresis right now. We're flying or driving apheresis machines and nurses to local community hospitals that don't have them. We're talking about putting them on wheels, right? When and if we're ready, and we're talking with therapeutic sponsors about these things. I think there's many conversations happening already about talking about outpatient infusions, right? Where we can bring the infusions to a more comfortable setting, closer to the patient, where they live. I think all of these conversations are happening because I think it is, I mean, as was suggested on the panel, it is really about bringing this whole ecosystem of manufacturing and supply beyond these centers of excellence to the secondary, tertiary, you know, cities in every country.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody up here is suggesting that we come to some level of, again, tiered standardization based on systems, procedures, equipment. Once you do that, then it becomes portable and you can move it wherever you need to. But setting up that foundation is key, and I think one of the other things that's come out, I mean, CRB puts out a Horizons report every year. The new one just came out last week. The one in 2023 had a whole section on decentralized manufacturing. And one of the key questions was what's needed to enable decentralized manufacturing. It didn't matter if we were talking about North America, Europe, small, medium, large pharma. The biggest response was we need more clarity and consistency from the regulatory bodies. You can see there's the discussion we're having up here about what is decentralized manufacturing. Is it regional? Is it decentralized? Is it distributed? Is it a point of care? It's probably all of them. But the idea, I think, that everybody is, you know, saying, and they can feel free to disagree with me, of course, is that we're trying to create clones of these facilities everywhere, and that's going to be an important part of the regulatory as well, because if the regulators have to go and inspect every single decentralized spoke, you'll never have a network because you'll constantly be under inspection. You'll be waiting years to get inspected. So we need to work with them as well on kind of how we're going to do this and manage this from an inspection perspective from PLI, PAIs.
And I think we've already started, you know, we've already heard from the agency that they don't expect, you know, to implement that model. Right?
They said that as long as they were clones of each other. If they said
Right.
as long as they're on the same quality system, they're 100% for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
One last question.
Full circle.
Full circle. I'm Claudia Zilberberg, by the way, for those who don't know me. Two things. One, each region may require regulatory, and we'll see these therapies not necessarily as a pharmaceutical product, but mostly as a procedure. Maybe some geographies will not buy on the idea of pharmaceutical product because it's going to be too expensive, but perhaps a procedure is something that their reimbursement will allow. So it's something to think. I know that is some noise and it's quite far away, but it's something interesting to think about how that is going to work. And on the facility side, FDA already has a regulatory body that's called IPEAC, and they do inspection, and there is an umbrella, which is something that is for biopharma, and Richard McFarlane, that is here in this chair, may know more about it. But IPEAC actually does regulatory globally and inspect biopharma facilities. We may need to start to work with them to perhaps do the work on cell and gene therapy as well, because the structure already exists. So just a note.
Thank you, Claudia.
I don't believe that we'll ever have a situation where we have a procedure being approved, because genetically modifying a cell is not a minimal manipulation. You can have great variety, just changing even some sequences. So I think it'll always be a product and a pharmaceutical that you'll have to, if it's a new entity, take through clinical trials and get approval.
Yeah, hi. Excellent meeting. I have two challenges for the panel. I want you to talk about if we just characterize this process wrong from the beginning and calling it a manufacturing product or a manufactured product instead of a procedure done to cells. That's just for the sake of thinking about it. And the second one is the biggest challenge always has been mentioned about the sterile room, a clean room, close to the hospital. But hospitals are used to clean rooms. And possibly the talk should be on how we can improve closed systems in the complete supply chain in order for us not to be talking about the clean room. Those are the two philosophical questions for the
Thank
panel.
you. I mean, I think we answered the first one already. I mean, I don't know if anybody
Yeah.
disagrees. I think, you know, I think in one way or another, and I think the regulatory burden or obligation or threshold may be different in different countries, but I think, you know, I think in most regions, these are going to be manufactured products. On the clean room, I mean, this is a question we talked about in the pre-panel. Matt, I'll start with you. I certainly see a version of the world at some point where there's enough data, as Ian suggested, over time about manufacturing these systems in closed, automated systems that the regulators become comfortable allowing us to do the procedures in these systems in lower and lower and maybe eventually uncontrolled environments, similar to how we process blood today. What do you think the path to getting from here to there is in terms of our interactions with the regulators?
I mean, I think this is going to be a game of inches or feet. This is not going to be home runs. We're already seeing some movement in this area, certainly with the FDA, some with the EMA, and I think, you know, in other jurisdictions as well. The idea that we may go to no clean room, I know of like one or two, and I'm sure you do as well. There's one or two IITs that were doing that, but it's not something that's typically going to be passed on like a PLI, PAI type basis, at least not at the moment. I think we need to get the regulators more comfortable and have a long track record of doing this in a closed manner. I do unfortunately disagree on the hospital. We work a lot with hospitals and we get a lot of material from hospitals, and most of the time that material is contaminated. It's why when you get resections for TILs, they typically come in antibiotics, and we have to remind them that beta-lactams are not acceptable in our GMP facility. So, I mean, it's clean for hospital, but I think it's all in context that, you know, a clean room in an ISO 7 facility is just, it's just not the same, and it's probably not comparable at the moment. And so I think what we should be shooting for is like a CNC space, honestly.
Right. We talked a little bit in the prep session too about maybe the evolution being, first of all, getting regulators comfortable with multiple products being done at one time, or multiple patients, same product, in a clean room at the same time, then moving to multiple products potentially in the clean room at the same time, and then moving to lower and lower clean room, controlled environments. I mean, is that a logical path, do you think, with regulators in your collective experience?
Yeah, that's what they expect. They want to see a risk-based approach, and they want to see this stepwise. They're not going to be comfortable with going from ISO 7 to, completely not classified. So we need to do this stepwise. We need to generate data. We need to walk through our approach with risk assessments that really focus on what are the risks that we're mitigating, how are we mitigating them, and yeah, this will be a slow, steady progression towards less and less classified spaces that will ultimately make the production costs go down.
Exactly. It's about having that repetition of the data during application development, a lot of in its single-use systems, really, in all these technologies, and having that data of multiple successful runs with no contamination in these systems. A lot of tool providers or even customers testing out different technologies that have come out will order quarter leukopaks and do multiple runs rather than one big run for that exact reason, to get multiple data points. And moving from a successful, healthy material run, then we see them advancing to a disease state run where they're really foolproof their system to see, is it going to clog, is it going to have a contamination, to really stress test that consumable and the technology.
All right, please join me in thanking my panelists. That's a wrap for today.